Welcome to the Center for Universal Oneness. We are an open, welcoming, spiritual community that supports all faith traditions and invites you to join us on your spiritual journey. We host different speakers each week to guide and inspire us. We are guided by universal principles of acceptance of all that is sacred, and we strive to live in the oneness of love. Please enjoy this presentation.
There you go. Thank you. You guys, we are exceedingly lucky to have Dr. Jude LaClaire with us today. She's going to talk about, the title is Time for Change, and then let me tell you a little bit about that. She says, as we find ourselves weary from toxic polarization, it's timely and necessary to find ways out, personally and collectively. We will explore some of these important solutions. This talk is based on the book, The Way Out, How to Overcome Toxic Polarization by a guy named Peter Coleman. And so then here we have her take on the process. And I personally am, I love to hear it. I want to hear what she has to say.
Am I on?
Bar.
Okay.
It's you.
All right. So I thought that might be a good intro. We can work it out. And that's kind of the theme that Peter Coleman has in his book, The Way Out, How to Overcome Toxic Polarization. And I think you mentioned that you saw it on CBS on the morning news. Got introduced to it on the PBS NewsHour on January the 10th. If you want to go look at their archives and watch that, it has a lot of good information too about this and groups that are doing some of these things. So let's think about where we are. The nation is stuck in what might be called a 50-year trajectory of increasingly toxic polarization that is highly addictive. And you're in the middle of it. I'm in the middle of it. From 83 to 90% of the population feels worn out by this state of affairs. Some are depressed, some are anxious, maybe some don't care. Some distract themselves with other things. Some are looking for a way out. So Peter T. Coleman, who's a professor of psychology and education at Columbia University, also holding a joint appointment at Teachers College and the Earth Institute and directing 2 research centers, has found time to write this book and many others on the topic of working with conflicts. He's pretty much spent his career on conflict resolution, working in peace building. So we're kind of reminded here of the Cherokee story about the elder talking to his grandson, and he says, a fight is going on inside of you. It's a terrible fight between 2 wolves. One wolf represents fear, anger, envy, greed, arrogance, and ego. The other stands for joy, peace, love, hope, kindness, generosity, and faith. The same fight is going on inside of you and inside of everyone else too. The child asks, which wolf will win? And he says, the one you feed. So I think a lot of today is going to be talking about what do we feed within ourselves, with others, and how does that make a difference in how we live in the world and how we respond in the world. As I made my way through Coleman's insightful and sort of complex journey, I was kind of really pushed to questioning my own thinking, my approaches, and my own stuckness. He quotes Mary Parker Follett, a pioneer in conflict resolution between labor and management. Actually, she lived in the early part of last century. It seems to me that whereas power usually means power over, the power of some person or group over some other person or group, it is possible to develop the conception of power with a jointly developed power, a coactive, not a coercive power. Coercive power is the curse of the universe. Coactive power, the enrichment and advancement of every human soul. That's a quote from her. So we like to think we're on one side of that coin and not on the other, but we're all on both, aren't we? And we all have that within us. And we find that in our families, our communities, our country, and so on. So that's the journey we wish to take today. And what I would say is that today's form of misery and instability may be the catalyst for radical change. So you think about it. Just as weather conditions evolved to create the perfect storm, today's social, environmental, political, and health issues are factors creating this pathological polarization. So there are two different ways of looking at problem solving. And according to, this is according to Coleman, one of them he calls, and this will not be news to you, but I thought it was interesting the way he framed it. One is called a clock problem, which is more like Newtonian physics, more logical, linear, rational. The other is a cloud problem that is based on quantum theory, highly irregular, disorderly, uncontrollable, and have an unpredictable nature. Sound familiar? Some of you may remember the book, The Tao of Physics, and that came out, what, in the late 70s, maybe early 80s. So we think about that switch from looking at some problems are definitely clock problems. This is it, this is how it is, and this is how we solve them. This is not a clock problem. This is a cloud problem. And that means that it has, let me see that again, highly irregular, disorderly, uncontrollable, unpredictable. And according to the quantum theory, about randomness and the uncertainty principle. Okay, now how comfortable are we with that? Most of us, not too much, right? But that is what we're thrown into. So one of the examples that Coleman uses about groups working with this is, I guess, in Boston in 1994, a man killed two innocent people, one at a Planned Parenthood site and one at a health clinic. And in the aftermath, that was 28 years ago. In the aftermath of that, the groups actually, what we call the pro-choice, the pro-life group, got together and began to meet with one another. And actually, two of them were interviewed on that PBS special, talking about their dialogues with one another. And some of them have remained friends to this day. Now, they still understand that they kind of have this irrevocable differences that they cannot maybe come to the table about, but they can respect one another. They can treat one another with respect as they disagree. And many of them over this period of 28 years became friends and have remained friends, which I find quite remarkable. And he talks about them quite a bit. So that's kind of a group that kind of put some of this into practice, some of this cloud thinking. So he urges us first to think about how we can make changes. So first is to do more cloud thinking or rethink our ideas about how to solve problems. We all think, well, this is how, these people just do that. These people just think this way and that way, and I don't understand them, which I've said things like that how many times, and how many of my friends have said the same thing. So I'm sitting here in my intractable position in which I have no idea really, actually, a lot of times where the other person might be or where they're coming from, because a lot of it, we presume, right? I presume, I would have to say, I'm not going to say you do. So that's when we actually, what happens is in that process, trust goes down, we close ranks, we prepare for battle because we are in this thing that now is more complex and volatile, we're more anxious, and we tend to think in simplistic terms, right? The we, they sort of thing, right? So think about your own, and then he talks about what he calls, here's what gets, I guess, stimulated or evoked by this process. He calls them attractors. As a therapist, I think about them a little differently, but what attractors are is there are patterns of thinking, feeling, behaving, social clustering. But think about your own history of experiences. Think about your genetic history, your family, your personality, your environmental influences, educational, and so on. All these influences that are within you, like each of us is a container, right, of all that personal, unconscious, conscious parts of our being, right? And we carry them within us. And in any given situation, what happens? Those get evoked. So they call those attractors, and the society has kind of the same thing. So he thinks about, let's think about how we can figure what we're going to do with cloud thinking when we're kind of being triggered by these attractors within us or that are within the society. So what he wants us to do or think about is he calls it radical re-landscaping. All right. So think about, I know we had our backyard re-landscaped. Now, first a bulldozer came in and just knocked down everything that was there. And then it smoothed it all out. And then we had things planted. And, we didn't do any of this. We had it done. But it was radical re-landscaping. But think about that with your brain, your heart, your thoughts, your ideas. Are you ready to think about radical re-landscaping to rethink this, right? Okay. Thinking radically, looking more holistically at the many factors perpetuating the conflict, as well as looking at the less obvious avenues for change. So look at the context of the conflict and looking at the energy within it that can kind of heal that situation. So here there are 5 practices that he suggests. I'm going to kind of run through those. As I said, this is the Cliff Notes, so bear with me. The first one is called resetting. So think about how catalysts are often the beginning of a great change. So in AA, Alcoholics Anonymous, they talk about hitting bottom and having a spiritual awakening. So it's like a crisis within myself says, ooh, I have a problem. And then I have this awakening. So think about maybe some issues about loss, death, health issues, job changes, relationship issues, perhaps an accident, all kinds of things that could be happening. We're in the midst of a lot of them culturally right now, aren't we? We have the environmental issues, we have the racial issues, the political issues, and it's kind of like a perfect storm. So they have that, and then you have your own personal stuff, right? And I know, because I know some of you have talked about this, and I know some of your stories have had some pretty challenging losses in your life, changes that I hope for all of us, it becomes, those of you that have my daughter's 48 now, but we went through some pretty challenging times as she was going through her adolescence and 20s. In terms of kind of coming into the adult world. So, that process and journey with our children, with family members, with ourselves, the death and loss and so on, whether it's work, whether it's our family, big losses. What do they do for us? They often kind of wake us up. It's like, okay, we cannot continue in the same way. We cannot. So if we take that opportunity, we change. And that's that radical re-landscaping. So how can we use these catalysts of today's toxicity to grow individually, as a family, as a community? So think about this. Do you see any positive changes happening around you or in response to these challenges? We think of, most recently, of course, almost now we're coming on to the beginning of the 3rd year being in COVID. What has that brought out for us individually and as a community? And what positive things do you see coming up? Yes, we see the negatives. I do. They're posted in front of us every day. But what are the positives? What about George Floyd and all the other Black people that we didn't even know about, some of us that have been killed over the last number of years? These are moments that give us pause, and we begin to think, what can we do differently? So think about things you and others have done in response to COVID or environmental issues or racial issues. And do you see growth or a resetting or a new beginning? So that's the process of resetting. What is the new beginning? What is the change? What does it become the change you wish to see? But what is the thing that propels us to that changing, that radical re-landscaping? Often it's trauma of some kind or another, whether it's personal, whether it's community, whether it's bigger, worldwide, that triggers us. to something. And it's painful, isn't it? Very painful. But it is that catalyst. The second step is what he calls bolstering or breaking. So how do you then kind of bolster that experience of awakening? So one of the things Coleman talks about here is one of my favorite stories to highlight this practice. And some of you remember Norman Cousins, who wrote a book called Anatomy of an Illness. He was diagnosed with this mysterious crippling illness. And he tells us about the medical approaches with painkillers and other kinds of things that weren't very helpful. And he decided to trust the innate healing wisdom of his body, checked into a hotel, watched funny videos, took supplements, including large doses of vitamin C, and found that 10 minutes of laughter gave him 2 hours of pain-free sleep. So think about how a challenge helped you to do cloud thinking and find what he calls the latent hidden bubbles of positive deviance. That's a whole nother language that I've learned here. He calls them bubbles, and this is how the sociology community thinks about it. So they're called positive deviance. Okay, so Norman Cousins was doing positive deviance, but what did he find? He looked at the problem and he said, how can I feel better? Well, I feel better when I laugh. I feel better when I have peace and quiet. I feel better when I'm in charge of my life. I feel better when I'm taking, like vitamin C and it's getting my immune system boosted. By the way, he did recover for the most part from that. He wrote another book about his heart attack. I have, I think, 3 major books that I have of his. So that kind of gives us an idea, about what we do with this process of finding the positive within the negative situation, right? So in September, I talked about John Gottman and different ways of communicating. I'd forgotten, so you probably have too, but anyway, I looked at it and I saw that I did. That's what I did talk about. So he talks a lot about Gottman, so that made me like him a lot too. And his approach to relationship or counseling focus, which focuses on these ideas, like helping couples focus on positive qualities about each other. Like one of the things you do is the appreciation dialogue. What do I appreciate about you? Here are these wrangling people, and you say, okay, could you say something? I understand that you're really upset. And however, I would like you to just play with this for a minute. Could you say one thing you appreciate about this other person? So you're redirecting, right, to finding something that might be positive. So this person isn't 100% bad, but the foreground of my situation is saying she or he sucks, they're bad, they're awful, and I can't deal with them anymore, right? And so we forget anything that could be positive within that person. So talking about those positive experiences, the positive qualities, turning towards rather than away. So think about this in relationship to our families, our communities, our political community, finding ways to weaken our worst tendencies and strengthen our latent positive energy, kind of overcoming that resistance to change. I found that since reading this, I've been thinking, okay, when I read an article, when I think about things I'm upset about, I try to think about, okay, what might that person be thinking? What might be going on with them? And how could I how could I use my energy differently? In Buddhism, and I know you have similar kinds of practices that you think about, and we may use different words, but one of the things I learned early on, which I thought was really interesting, is when, let's say you have an intractable issue with a person. So instead of, like the Beatles say, I want you to listen to me, it's like, okay, I'm gonna listen to you, right? I'm gonna pay attention to what you're thinking. And I'm gonna think maybe about a different way to think about you. And I'm gonna think about a different way to embrace something in you that I might appreciate. So I think that as we're looking at that, I've been finding, that idea that we say, I don't chant for somebody to change, I chant or pray for their Buddha nature to awaken. So that's a positive thing. Everybody has, you call it the God nature, the Christ nature, call it whatever, I don't care what we call it, right? It's that essential aspect of wholeness within each individual that contains everything, as you talk about the oneness of everything. So it's within each person, isn't it? It's within each situation. So I'm thinking my prayer is to awaken that nature within myself, within this person, within this system, right? So that we can somehow find some way forward. So I've always found that to be kind of helpful. Like, I'm not chanting you to be like me. I'm not asking you to change. I'm asking for that energy within you, like Norman Cousins, finding that positive deviance, he calls it that. I like to think about it as a little bit differently, but that's the words he used for it, right? So how can we awaken that in ourselves and send that energy to every person and being that we may even have the worst feelings about? And I was reminded a little bit too of situations in which things like this have happened. Maybe some of you saw the movie and maybe read the book called The Best of Enemies, about the Black African-American woman who was an activist and a guy who was a Ku Klux Klan leader. And she ended up reaching out to him. They ended up having a dialogue, and they ended up actually working together and being lifelong friends. Okay. So those things happen, don't they? They do happen. They happen when we quit accusing, when we quit blaming, when we quit pointing fingers. I'm right, you're wrong. No, I'm going to listen. Yes, we take a stance. Yes, we have strong beliefs. I'm quite that way. I'm sure many of you are. So anyway, think about the bolstering breaking as finding that positive, the innate positivity within any situation. Okay, it's there. But if you're looking at the negative, how to stop something, how to make it go away, how to kill it, how to do, it doesn't work, does it? We all know that it doesn't work. So you have to reinforce the positive, redirect towards the positive, right? Okay. So the third part, and this one I found to be also very interesting, he calls it complicating. And I know you all think y'all are complicated and you think in deep, complicated ways. So I know this will not be a stretch for you. But he calls about what he calls contradictory complexity. And he uses the example of Megan Phelps Roper. So you all know who she is. She's the granddaughter of Fred Phelps, who is the founder of the Westboro Baptist Church in Topeka. So I'm sure you're fully aware of who she is. You may have been, as I have, at places where I've been standing up or protesting or making a point in a public arena, and they've been there, right, with their signs. God hates fags, and now God hates everybody according to them. But anyway, it wasn't a pleasant experience to watch them. One of the best things, I wasn't not there when this happened, where some of the people in a group that were protesting, and the Phelps people were there, had these kind of cutouts of angels that they held up all around the group. And I thought that was really kind of a nice reframe. That it's like, okay, we're just going to call on the good spirits here to be with us and the protective forces to be around us. It's nothing about you. It's just protection for those of us that are here speaking our truth. So anyway, what happened with Megan was that she began finding biblical contradictions to this teaching that she had been immersed in since birth. So he would call that our social identity complexity. So that those contradictions finally led her out of this belief system, and she left the church, obviously was ostracized by her family. But this story, he says, illustrates the extraordinary power of certainty. This is what she was raised as: certainty, dichotomous thinking, and oversimplification that influences our understanding of the world. So I know I get caught in that certainty and dichotomous thinking and oversimplification, when I'm thinking my righteous things about people or situations. And looking at what he would call the power of contradiction, understanding the world, and the power of contradiction and complexity for correcting it. Okay, so it is complex. So if I look at someone as a cut out cardboard figure that's very simple and this is who they are, probably not. Probably not. And if I were to sit down with that person or that group, what would I see? What would I experience? So in this chapter, he challenges us to map our social identity complex. That is everything. Like, who are you? I am. And you think about all the things. Something I experienced recently that really kind of a little bit blew my mind. And a Black person was making a presentation. They said, when you think about your identity, she says, I think about putting down African-American or Black. Do you ever put down white? When somebody asks who you are? I never do. I never have. Why? Because it's assumed I'm white and I'm okay and I'm accepted as white, right? Do I say, down the line that I'm Buddhist? Yeah, because that's different. And it may not always be acceptable in a Christian society. Or do I say sometimes that I'm a lesbian? Yes, because that is a part of myself that I've had to fight in some ways to think about, to embrace, and then to respect myself, and then to be okay with. And to let other people know that I'm not some, monstrous person who's a sexual predator or some other sort of thing that people are made out to be. So I think that looking at our own social identity complex, it helps us. He said, one of the things I thought was really made me think, he said, if you have most things in your social identity complex that are harmonious, so you think about a lot of us as white, heterosexual, Christian, middle class, blah, blah, blah. It's like, there's nothing in there that's contradictory. There's nothing in there hardly that gives us too much pause, right? So he said, well, what about if you're gay and you're in a religiously conservative religion? That's a contradiction that's a contradiction that makes your social identity more complex, and you may be more open to differences in other people. So this really kind of got me going. I'm going, well, I can't be that, and I started looking at all the things about myself, and I go, well, yeah, in some ways I'm kind of in that place where, there isn't maybe a lot of complexity, and I've kind of been able to fit in. On the other hand, I have parts of myself that are not typically usual and that have given me lots of understanding about differences in other people. But boy, what it really kind of knocked me on the head was, Jude, you have a ways to go, because there are a lot of experiences I have no idea about. And I shouldn't assume that I do know about them, okay? Because it's not in my identity, okay? So I think looking at that social identity complex and looking about what is more harmonious or contradictory, I think our social or internal differences help us are more appreciative of the social identity complex of others, So I just think that's something for us to think about as people who, to some degree, and I don't know all of your histories, but that I'll just say for myself that I grew up in, and I'm a white person. So I obviously, as we thought, now thinking that you didn't think growing up, well, this was a privilege that other people don't have. I was not aware of that. My first awareness was my first African-American friend in high school. I'm still friends with. She's now the head of the Sisters of Charity. And her father was a psychologist who was very helpful to me and became a mentor for me. But it's like, and we would think, oh, I met her as a sophomore in high school, 1956. And we say, well, let's go to a movie. Oh, I can't go to that movie. I said, why? You cannot go? She said, no, I can't they won't let me in. I said, what? I had no idea. I had no idea. When she applied to the order, she said, well, I don't know if they'll accept me because I'm Black. And I'm going, what? Why? And I said, well, if they don't accept you, I'm not going either. It's like, but I had no idea, absolutely no idea. I mean, I knew that, I was there in Kansas City when they desegregated the swimming pools, and it got so contentious that they closed them all. Okay. So, but I really have to say, I didn't get it. Really. I'm not sure I really still get it, but I'm trying. And I'm trying to listen and pay attention to that contradictory complexity. Okay. So I would just invite you into that. That complicating one, I think, is one of the hardest. The next part is called moving. And this one I found kind of interesting and kind of something to pay attention to. He said, when we're moving physically, when we're doing something different, when we're breaking routines and learning something new, it helps us to activate towards more novel pathways in the brain and set us on a course. So, and also moving in sync with others can help us to forge deeper social bonds. So this is actually, this is from a website that I'm going to suggest that all of you might look at. It's called thewayoutoffpolarization.com. And there's a wonderful thing there. Coleman and a few others, his colleagues, have all these, summaries of the chapters and exercises, which might be wonderful for us to do at a different time, or for you to do at a different time. So here are some of the things he talks about with Get Moving, which some of these things, this is not quite new information to you, but something to say, wait a minute, these are things I could do when I'm stuck. Travel. We can't do a lot of traveling right now. Take a walk in a new place. Walk and talk with someone. Play a team sport. Find a new place for an old conversation. He talks about where people are stuck in a meeting and they go out and walk around the block together, have a meal together. Guess what? It changes the conversation. Changes the conversation. Plan or suggest an off-site activity with colleagues or a work team. Share a meal, give a hug, join a choir, take an art class, collaborate on a project, cook with someone, cook something new and unfamiliar, volunteer. Identify your most common strategies or reaction and choose to try a new way. Go for a bike ride. I've tried that on my balance isn't as good as it used to be. Listen to music with other people. Play catch, dance alone with someone or with someone else. Exercise, find and practice a new hobby. Plant a garden, which I've been doing a lot of. Join a community garden. Learn an instrument. I've been interesting to say how many people have been doing some of these things because of COVID, and they might have not done them otherwise. I know I'm doing way more workout in the yard, taking more walks. Of course, with my wife, I'm trying to get my 8,000 steps in every day. So I'm trying to do more walks. So anyway, I thought this was pretty interesting. And I want to read a poem to you that I thought when I was talking about this, I ran into this poem. It's a poem by Mary Oliver. Some of you are probably well familiar with her. She's one of my favorite poets. The name of the poem is I Worried. I worried a lot. Will the garden grow? Will the rivers flow in the right direction? Will the earth turn as it was taught? And if not, how shall I correct it? Was I right? Was I wrong? Will I be forgiven? Can I do better? Will I ever be able to sing? Even the sparrows can do it, and I'm, well, hopeless. Is my eyesight fading, or am I just imagining it? Am I going to get rheumatism, lockjaw, dementia? Finally, I saw that worrying had come to nothing and gave it up and took my old body and went out into the morning and sang. So I think that might be a wonderful thing for us to do. All right, so let's think of the last step, which is called adapt. And this might be the hardest part. And the quote is to seek evolution for revolution. That's a big mouthful. So what does that mean? It means that we're settling in for a long journey. Now, those of you, I have someone, older than I, but you know what? It is a long journey. And I think, wow, I could live to be 100. I can live 20 more years. That's a long time. And it's like, okay, I can't believe, to me, 80 is a number, but it's like, because I look at my life as kind of a whole. I'm sure you all feel the same way. Your body ages, but internally you're still the same person, right? And you're going, okay, now what? So this evolution for revolution because you've been living it, right? And you're not the same person, and yet you are. So that is settling in for this journey that will require, as he says, considerable adaptation. We should expect problems and setbacks. The problems are complex. Focus on learning to respond adaptively to dynamic problems and learning in the face of new problems. So I want to just say, I noticed my battery is low because I changed locations and I'm not plugged in. So I think I'll be okay. But anyway, I have to plug my computer in a moment. So these are the steps, and this is on the website, by the way. New rules for the way out. 1, see the way out. Recognize that others are finding it. There's hope when we believe in change. 2, stop. Take time for a pause in your life to recalibrate, regroup, and begin again. Shift your habits of mind, change your theory of change. Spot positive deviance or what is already working in your community or within yourself. Simplify, but only after complicating your experience and understanding. Synchronize, move forward together with others in a way that free up and connect. Settle in for a long journey that will require considerable adaptation. And lastly, support. Find others who you can connect with for support and join in common cause. Okay. So anybody have any thoughts or whatever or questions that you want to ask about this? And I'm going to get my charger because I might leave you in a moment here. I'm listening.
Well, one of the things that I've been thinking about is that when I'm in conflict or when I'm judging other people and I realize what I'm doing, the first thing I want to do is to begin to look at how I can soften my own positionality about things, because a lot of my judgment is based on my own positionality. If I didn't take such rigid positions about things, then there wouldn't be so much conflict with other people's positions about things, because it is that hardening of position thinking that puts us into disagreement. And so if I want to look for a perspective that is inclusive, I have to soften my own attachment to my own positionality and judgment and begin to be willing to look at the perspective that is not only inclusive, but also enlarging. It includes the other perspective, but in a way that makes it a win-win proposition. Yes. I'm reminded of an article I read about pro-life and pro-abortion folks getting together and having a dialogue, and they ended up finding something they could agree on. And yeah. What they ended up agreeing on was that everybody wants a wanted child in the world. That we wanted all children in the world to be wanted.
Yes.
So looking for that larger perspective, looking for that unifying aspect yes. of what your positions are is a very useful tool.
Yes, yes. Great, thank you. Yeah. Anybody else have any thoughts or questions or comments?
Have you ever heard of a book called Getting to Yes?
No, I've not.
It's about moving off of your quote position and okay. looking beneath that position for the underlying concerns.
Okay. Okay.
And as you start to do that, the underlying concerns of the differing parties start to the differing positions, the concerns start to bring about agreement. Like, oh yeah, that is something that we can agree on because we both have a concern around it. Whereas the position is the thing that is the polarization.
Yes.
It's an old, not old, but it's like 20 years old, this book, and it from Harvard negotiation team.
Okay. One of the things I'll also mention is that on page 130 of the book, and it was also mentioned in the PBS article, and I'll just go through some of these. There's all these groups that are doing this. One of them is the StoryCorps group called One Small Step. Some of you may know about that. Common Ground Committee, the Aspen Weave, the Social Fabric Project, Aspen, that go to that website. That's really kind of amazing. David Brooks is very much a part of that. One America Movement, Civic Health Project, Bridge USA, Bridging Divides Initiative, Better Angels, Resetting the Table, Greater Good Science Center. Let's see. Anyway, yeah. Caucus for Country, More in Common, American Exchange Project. So those are just all these groups that are forming to do this conversation, this conversation of listening and doing exactly what you were talking about, and listening to each other in a way and looking at it as more complex and not just simple, going with our simplistic interpretations. The news do that, both the liberal and conservative channels do it, and I don't like it. We oversimplify and go in one direction, and then we just keep hammering it over and over and over. And it's like, I just think it's so important for us to kind of protect ourselves to some degree from, getting immersed in kind of something that keeps us in that negative headspace. And finding ways. I'm not a Pollyanna. I know none of you are either, but we've got to find our way out in a positive way. And if I'm cranky and anxious and upset, I can't help anybody. And so, and my energy, whether I'm talking to a client, whether I'm going to the store, walking down the street, or sitting in my home, I'm not helping anyone, including myself, when I'm in that angry, confused, anxious place, right? So I have to keep finding ways to come back to do that radical re-landscaping within myself, right? And then so that I can be more of a healthy contributor in the world. Anybody else? I know this is not news to any of you. To me, it just was a different way of looking at it that was quite thoughtful and helpful and sometimes unsettling, I'd have to say.
Hey, Jude, yeah, I've got a comment. I think what you said, there's a lot of truth in it, but I think what we have to be careful is surrendering our beliefs and our values. I think it's very important when we interact with people that disagree,
Yes.
that we don't dehumanize them and we don't see them in one thing, and
Right.
that we try to find commonality. Like maybe
Right.
you like to eat the same food we eat or something like that. You can get commonality with them.
Yes.
What I find on the left these days, there's a lot of surrender going on.
Mhm.
And I think that's been healthy for our society. We're about to lose our democracy here. And we have to assert our values, and we got to do it in a productive way. And I think that's what you're trying to get there.
Yes.
But,
Yes.
I recently read, I think a person in Dalai Lama's group was talking about the fact that he surrendered China and surrendered his people to the Chinese communists.
Mhm.
There's an aspect there.
Mhm.
So, peace is good, but you have to have justice and you have to have
Right.
things happening for people also.
Well, and I think it's a very good point. And I've thought about this. And that is a delicate balance, isn't it? It's a delicate balance to find out how to be true to ourselves and what we believe so strongly, to be fierce, and also then to be respectful, to be aware of the other in a way that is sometimes impossible when we have such strong feelings. And I do think it's a very, very difficult thing to do. And I agree. I've had that same thought. Well, you don't want to just sit here and go, oh, everything's going to be good now and just think nice things about people. No, I have my beliefs. You have your beliefs. We have very strong beliefs. And I think we have to be fierce about who we are. And we cannot gain ground within ourselves or others if we are in any way, if we are disrespectful. That doesn't mean we don't have good boundaries. So I think I've had to learn a lot as an adult to set boundaries, to say no, to say, this is where I start and you stop. This is what I'll do. This is what I'll not do. This is what I will not allow you to do to me, because I will remove myself. I can't stop you, but I can remove myself. So setting boundaries is very, very important. Okay. And do it, but I just think how we go about it. And I think you talked about that idea of how we do this is more important. then, but I think we don't want, you're right. And it is, I don't think it's easy. I think this is really hard. It is something I often struggle with, right? How to do that, how to maintain my wishes for things to happen that I think must happen, for us to maintain what we have. On the other hand, you know, like you said, I'm going to give in to evil as what I see as something evil, even if the person doing it is good. You know what I mean? And so I just think and I think each situation is quite different too, quite different. Good point.
Well, this is an area I think our community could benefit from a conversation and dialogue among ourselves in regard to, because taking the devil's advocate position, I think our concern about our identity and our concern about our positions, that's all ego-based. And if you're wanting to raise your consciousness into the spiritual, you've got to be willing to look for something larger than what the ego is saying we have to have. And I ran across a quote the other day that I just thought was amazing, and that is, no living thing has any rights. Now think about that for a minute. No living thing has any rights. What that means is that all the so-called rights that we are attached to and that we want and that we live by are man-made, given to ourselves by ourselves because we think it's important to what and who we are. But if you're a spiritual being, are you concerned about that? I don't know, because I don't think the same issues apply. So Greg and I can probably have a really good conversation about that.
Right. Well, I do think that this really, for myself, I'm thinking I just have a lot of thinking, talking, you know, praying, being with others. I really have to digest some of this and think about. I do think just going inside and figuring some of these things out better from time to time is so helpful. To just take a check here on where I am. And I have, just even since reading this, I feel like I'm trying to, I'm not trying to be a Pollyanna or, like you said, step back, but to say I'm trying to look at the more positive aspects that I can bring out in myself and others so that I can be capable of doing what I can do in my environment. I don't want to cripple myself in my process with my negativity or focusing on negativity in others, okay? I mean, I see a lot of people that are quite different than myself. And I don't look at them and try to look at the negative. I look at how can I help that person be a more positive individual? That's what I focus on. And it's easier for me to take that stance because I don't necessarily have an emotional investment in that person other than I want them to succeed and be a good person in every way. But I would never think about having any sort of political conversations for the most part, because that's not what this is about. And I figure if they can be a more positive, loving, whole human being, then they're going to contribute in ways that are helpful, hopefully. But anyway, yeah.
I think that the importance of listening is really underestimated. And I think that's one of the best ways to establish connections with other people, no matter their political beliefs or spiritual beliefs, no matter what. If you can genuinely listen to them and let them know that you're genuinely trying to reach an understanding, and I think it establishes connection, which I believe is truly important. And if you listen to them and understand them, you establish respect.
Yes.
And once you make those connections, then you can probably move on to other topics.
Yes.
And once you're connected with a person, it's more difficult to alienate them, more difficult to say, you're bad, I don't like what you think.
Right, right, right. No, I agree. And I again go back to, to what I've learned as a couples therapist, and I learned it as a counselor. The first thing we learned is to do reflective listening or mirroring, active listening. So somebody says something to you, instead of reacting, you just say, what I heard you say is, and you just reflect back to them what you heard. That's not easy to do.
No, it takes practice.
Reflective listening is absolutely difficult. Believe me, I do it with people all the time, and I try, I forget to do it myself. And I do my reactive thing, I do my judgmental thing, I do my angry thing, I do my whatever, my explaining self. And it's like, no, just listen without judgment, just listen. And I think when you do, it helps that person to be reflective towards what they're saying, instead of I'm doing the one doing it, right? Then I'm not going to do it for you. I'm going to sit here and help you do that for yourself. And I think, thank you for saying that. It's that whole listening thing is highly underrated, and it is probably one of the most powerful things you could ever do, I think.
I certainly agree.
Yeah. You're muted.
Oh, yeah. A lot of the yes, Sherry, absolutely. And Jude, a lot of the examples that you gave during your talk were people that were on complete opposite sides about their thoughts. But then when they engaged and started listening to each other and respecting each other, I think a lot of us have friends and family members who have different points of view, but to be heard I think is a basic human thing from the get-go. I mean, whether you're just a little baby and you're, you're getting attention, I think that's so important. And I think it's okay to have different, I relish differences of opinion. I think it makes things interesting. And I think the trick is to love them anyway, in spite of the fact that we don't think the same way. And I think what happens, and Doug, this is like what you're talking about with the ego thing. Oh, well, I think one way and they think another way, and then my ego is going to make them bad and wrong, and therefore I'm going to hate them and I'm going to hurt them, and because they don't think the same way I do. And I think that all those examples that you gave, and also Sherry, when you're listening and doing that active listening, you're setting an example for the other person that is like, it feels good to them. And then they go, oh, she or he, they're listening to me. And they may not think it through, verbally in their mind, but it sets an example for them to emulate down the road, of which we will never know.
Yes, I agree. I think that's true. I do think that's true. And I find it, I can do it at work really easily, and then I come home and I find it much more difficult. So I have to practice what I preach, practice what I know how to do when I'm with people that I'm more emotionally engaged with. That's where the rubber meets the road.
Well, in your comment about loving them anyway is really important, I think, because the Course in Miracles says that to have peace, be peace.
Yes.
And when you're listening, you're being peace.
Yeah.
And that creates an atmosphere of peace that the other person can then participate in. And that's real important to establish some unity of cooperation.
Yes, yes, yes. Yeah.
And I love what you said, Jude, about the moving together, and I think that's, I truly believe that's one of the things that Neil and I were so drawn to the Sufi path, because Dances for Universal Peace, where we're moving together in prayer with the movement and the music, and it's all together. And I'm like, I miss it. I miss it. I'm assuming on COVID is not going to do it for me with
Yeah.
move. And I think that, well, you know, I think when you move together,
Yes.
like Ida and I were moving together this
Right.
week. I mean, we were moving together while we were singing, and it was fun. We were having a lot of fun together, moving together
Yes.
and singing.
Well, and it's interesting because I think I really kind of think sometimes I get out of my body so much I forget these things. But he mentioned it. It's true. It's when I watch people, you know, walking down our street. It's harder to walk not in sync with somebody when you're walking with them than to walk in sync with them. Their steps are the same. You're taking the same steps, and you're in sync with your steps. And he mentions that it's harder to be out of sync walking with someone than in sync. So that's interesting that physically our tendency is to be in sync physically, right? And I've read too that, you know, in some countries, you know, that sometimes the women all menstruated at the same time. You know, it's like, whoa, that's pretty interesting. But I think sometimes women in a household do. So it's that being in sync physically with movement. And I think about my Buddhist practice. We haven't met in a long time. We met a few times last summer, and then they had the, you know, Omicron, but we chant. And so we're chanting together, all chanting together. And that sense of doing, whether it's chanting together, singing together, moving together, walking together, whatever, those kinds of things are quite powerful. Very powerful. Thanks for saying that.